musicologist. Welcome to Amari Music Talk. I'm Richard Cole, and today we're going to talk about the Beatles Anthology, the docuseries. Actually, 30th anniversary of the docuseries. It's been cleaned up. The sound's better. The picture's better. They changed some things. But it's all available for you to see on Disney Plus, and just going to dish a few thoughts about the documentary. But first, if you are a long-time listener, welcome back. If you're brand new to the channel, welcome. All right, so this primarily being a Prince channel. Well, it started off as a Prince channel. I think most of the listeners, it's either Prince or it's Funkadelic, or we don't usually cover a lot of Beatles material, although I have in the last, I would say probably a few months, decided to cover it. They are one of my favorite bands ever, whether you like them or don't like them. They definitely changed the course of history. A lot of innovations, or even how you think of albums. Your favorite artists wouldn't have gotten to that level of thinking of an album as art, had these cats not kicked open the door for that. But definitely for me, like I said, one of my favorites. Jumped in around, for me, 6 years after they broke up in 1970. They broke up in 70, so around 76, at the age of 10, I officially got into them and been listening to them ever since then. And I, dived into the history very early on. But it wasn't until really the 1995 Beatles Anthology project. A little quick background. After they broke up, the head of the company that they started, Apple, not to be confused with the computers, the Beatles, Apple was around a lot longer before, before Apple computers. But that's another story for another day. But the person they appointed to run it, Neil Aspinall, had gathered all of this footage of the Beatles and was intending to put it together as a documentary. Beatles being, officially broken up, lawsuits, bad blood for a number of years. Probably wouldn't have been a good idea to put it out then, but fast forward 25 years later, all the lawsuits are settled, the wounds have healed. Of course, sadly, no more John Lennon in the picture, but, the anthology was able to proceed. I first saw it on ABC in 95, and they did a three-episode event. Enjoyed that. Like I said, it's them telling their story. Since then, they had released it, an expanded version on VHS, and then later DVD, which is the one I got. But I remember going to the library, and every chance I got, checking out the VHS and just diving into it. And here we are 30 years later, celebrating that anniversary. While the documentary or docuseries itself had been highly anticipated and was something that the fan base wanted, the reissue of the anthology, as far as CD, was met with controversy. Of course, fans really, really wanted a Rubber Soul box set. And here we are, it's 2 years, and this is the definite year for 60th anniversary, but that's not going to happen for that. So this was released instead. And like I said, much controversy. Like I said, I was excited for the docuseries. Originally was going to get the box set of the CDs, which included a brand new volume full of more outtakes and stuff that's never been heard before. But like I said, lots of controversy. First, this was bundled in one big box set, and folks didn't want to rebuy the other 3 volumes that came out in 95 and 96, even though they were remastered. So decision was made, by the Beatles or Apple Corps to just release Volume 4 separately. I was going to get the box set originally, then decided, nah. And there's a book that comes along with it too, that came out like around the early 2000s. I've got both the hardback and a paperback of that. Was going to get the 25th anniversary of that release, but since there was no added material to the book, I decided, well, I'm not going to get that. Decided to change my mind on the box set and just decided to buy Volume 4 separately. But somewhere down the line, I may still get that box set though. Stuff's remastered, and I don't know. Sometimes I'm a completist, sometimes not. But eventually I might just get the whole box set. But I still have my original volumes. Still got those. But let's get into the documentary. Because like I said, I think, like I said, a lot of fans, as far as the music, like I said, not my most anticipated release, but was definitely excited to revisit the anthology. I didn't rewatch the DVDs at all because I didn't want to get too burned out. Even though like, oh, well, this footage is better, or they took this out, or they changed this, or the sound is a lot better. I still didn't want to burn out on it. So I just went in fresh. They released 3 episodes a night over the course of the Thanksgiving holiday weekend, holiday weekend. And I started with the first 3 episodes, and I was taking all kind of notes. And then after that, I was just kind of like, nah. So I'm just kind of going to really go more off the dome. I've watched it, the entire 9-part series many times over the weekend. So, like I said, just kind of going to go off the top of the dome with this. So basically let's say the differences, definitely when you watched it, if you had a chance to watch it on television back in the day, even though those episodes were like maybe a couple of hours a piece, with commercials, that was the shortest version. This version, I think it's a deeper dive. And I think, back then there was no streaming, there was no TikTok. And this is definitely, I think, for the deep cut fans, because you got more performance footage, which was great for then, for televisions and DVD for back then. But this, I think, and why I've titled this probably the most important documentary you would want to see, which I'm going to get to a little bit later. But as far as the differences, that is, if you have experienced this before, there was some stuff taken out. They made the episodes about 10-15 minutes shorter per episode. But I think it works. I think it streamlines everything. This being on something like Disney Plus, this isn't for the deep cut. But this is for, I would say, regardless of age, if you're new to the Beatles or if you really wanted to just figure out what it was all about, this is definitely the format. The timing of each episode is better. I think some of the differences I had with some of the aesthetic choices that were made in the original TV broadcast and even with the DVDs, especially with the earlier episodes. And to me, I think that was really how to handle the absence of John Lennon. Now, probably one of the most brilliant things that was done. And this was used to great effect in the John Lennon Imagine documentary that came out in '88. And, before the idea to do it with, artists like Tupac later on with, I think, Tupac Resurrection, where you use a lot of archival interview footage to kind of fill that gap. And it kind of gives you that this is either what, something that was taken from at the moment of a certain situation, or interviews, where Lennon is reflecting on something. and I think overall that was used to great effect. The kind of the issue I did have with it, with the earlier versions, like I said, especially the first few episodes, where they were kind of using, it's one thing if you use something taken from a television interview and you're just using just that, but there were certain parts of it where they were kind of using or manipulating that footage to make it seem like, like, well, we know he's not here, but let's give the illusion that he's talking to us now. And it would be things like, he would comment on something and then they would slow it down and he turns his head and he's smiling and it's like split screen with like Ringo or something to make it look like he's sitting in the room with Ringo. And it felt a bit cringy, as if, not taking, some cassette tapes of his and making brand new songs out of them. Some would say that's cringeworthy too, but it's really Apple, it's really two different things in regards to that. But I just found that editing choice a bit problematic as far as the documentary, and especially in the way documentaries have been done since. And I'm glad that now they have taken that part out of it. So if it's a quote where they just have audio interview footage, then there's just footage of whatever was happening that he's commenting on, or they just have just some random footage. They're not manipulating him, or some of it you do see it, but it's not as extensive and it's not cringeworthy. Like I said, they don't have him turning and panning to Paul or something, or trying to make it look like he's mouthing the words of whatever's being spoken, and going in more for actual video interview footage and letting that speak for itself, where you do have like the contemporary interviews with the other three at that time. Then you have him given equal time with, the full screen of, like I said, whatever television interview that they utilize to make that happen. So for me, that was a plus in them changing it for this one. Some of the things that they've added to it, a lot of it throughout, there's certain things, and especially with a lot of Lennon comments and some added George Harrison footage, that really, really kind of gives more context to certain events, or it gives a deeper explanation that you didn't get with this, even though, like I said, this is expanded. But a lot of the extras to me were, I don't know, like I said, with the, it's a deep dive for fans. So like I said, more performance footage, or they're trying to fill space because it's like, well, this is expanded and we got to give the fans more. But there's more commentary on things that aren't really necessary, and especially if you're getting into this for the first time, or this is going to be your first exposure, taking that much deeper dive than some recent documentaries have been able to present. So the narrative is tighter. It feels more like a documentary. It feels more like a docuseries. It feels more like a contemporary docuseries, even though this was done 30 years ago. And I think that was paramount, especially, like I said, putting it on, it didn't have to be Disney Plus, any streaming service, and to compete effectively with, documentaries that you see on streaming services, or docuseries that you see on streaming services. Like I said, the video has been cleaned up. I think one of the controversies, because now, we've got, 720p, 1080p, we've got 4K, we've got 8K. When you try to watch a documentary, or when you try to watch a DVD or regular DVD, then you do lose some image quality when you're watching it. And especially, like I said, with our TV screens, back then, a 28-inch TV screen was like, whoa. Even if someone had a bigger screen, or the screens that we have now, they weren't as commonplace in 1995 as they are now. So again, with the picture, that was one of the things now, like if they try to watch it on a modern television through their DVD player or their Blu-ray player, there is a lot of image quality that's lost throughout. But mainly with the contemporary interview footage, if anything should be clear and cleaned up, it's definitely that. And they did an excellent job there. I think with the older or archival color footage, that is much better. Some of the older archival black and white footage to me was kind of hit and miss. There was some stuff that was excellent, and there's some stuff that's like really bleached out or washed out with the cleanup process. But what makes up for some of that is the sound, the live performances. Because, we live in an age to where, there's a solution to just about everything when it comes to stage performance, fold back monitors. And that was something that, I don't know, when did that come about? Maybe later 70s, early, maybe the 80s, probably. I know definitely by the time you got to a Hendrix or a Led Zeppelin, you had the big Marshall amps. So that allowed you to be heard over, even at the latest 100-watt Vox amps that the Beatles had in those days. And, one of the problems that they had, especially the bigger that they were getting, was that nobody was hearing them. It's just like the minute they hit the stage, there's this big, ocean of screaming, and the screaming drowned out, with that limited technology. And plus, too, there's a lot of worlds that hadn't been conquered yet. When you get to something like them performing at Shea Stadium in '65, that's the first big stadium concert tour. There's, nowadays you have a Taylor Swift doing that in their sleep, now. But back then that has never happened, big stadium concerts. And again, by the time you hit the '70s, then again, the problem solving was in full effect. So by the time you got to a Led Zeppelin or the Who or Parliament Funkadelic or whoever, Earth, Wind and Fire, doing these big stadium shows, these big giant arena shows, then it didn't matter how loud you scream, they had the problem solved, with the speakers and the monitors and being able to hear yourself, being able to hear what's being played so you can give the best performance as a musician that you could. And those were some of the limitations. But as far as the sound, with the MAL technology, machine assisted learning technology, the way that they were able to now separate what John's singing with Paul's bass and Ringo's drums, the guitars and everything, we kind of always figured like, yeah, this is a great band. And even when you watch footage, even way back in the day, when you watch footage, it's like, what I think looking back now, it's like you feel that energy. You feel that energy coming off the records, even though as great as those records were, sometimes depending, the American mixes primarily just sucked, but nobody was thinking about that back then. Back then all you had were transistor radios and little tiny radios, little tiny record players. So, but you still felt that energy coming off the vinyl, or when you saw them, whether it was in person or whether you saw them on television, you still felt that energy. There was something that was still coming through despite the technological limitations. But when you listen to this footage now, wow, I don't want to say I get them as a live band. Like I said, I always felt that energy coming off, at whatever point you watch an old footage, and again, even though this was sort of state of the art at the time, visually and sonically, they cleaned it up the best that they could in, late 90s, early 2000s. With the technology available now, you really feel the power. And I think that's the thing. It's more than the energy you're getting from this band now. You're getting the power, you're getting the pulse of that energy. Because now it's like, oh, so that's what Ringo's bass drum is doing. Damn, I hear clearly what Paul is playing. And it's like, like I said, I've gotten, the gist of his bass playing with Wings, but yeah, what he was doing, coming off of that whole James Jamerson influence, you feel what he's doing, and to be able to do that and sing at the same time, you get that. And he makes it look so effortlessly. He's just, like, you get the power of this band when you listen to the audio on this now. Like I said, some of the things that were, like I said, they go into the making of the records more so than previous iterations of this anthology, which is a plus. Because I think before you were getting little sequences of, that panning around the studio, how, Abbey Road might have looked in those days, and you got the Beatles instruments placed there, but you don't have any, there's very little archival footage of them actually being in the room. There's plenty of photographs of them in the room and stuff, but as they're doing that, then you get like the sort of the stuff that you get on these anthology discs, which is, them working it out, them recording the song, you hear the studio chatter. You hear, take one, and, it breaks down, and then it's like it goes to take 2 or take 25 or something. But you get, it's shortened, but then you get more commentary about like, oh, well, this is how we approach making this record, so you get more of that, which is a plus as well. Some other instances, like some events, like, especially coming down to when they stopped touring or the reasons why they kind of gave up touring beyond, the sound quality and not being able to improve as musicians, like, hey, we're a really great band and we can really wipe you out. But, fans are just screaming because it's like, it's the image, as opposed to the musicality. Kind of some of the problems like D'Angelo faced, wanting to put on the best show, but, the focus was like him, them trying to get him to take his shirt off and stuff, stuff like that. But some of those have been shortened. If you want greater commentary, I would say definitely pick, try to find this. I think these are still relatively reasonable to get price wise. But some of those, like I said, the reasons why they stopped touring, like talking about Japan performing at the Budokan, the Philippines tour, how disastrous that ended up being, that was kind of shortened. What else is there? Kind of getting to, even things like the breakup. To me, I think I like it. It's abrupt, but it doesn't, it doesn't go into the whole blame thing. It's like Yoko didn't break up the Beatles. It's a thing that you got 4 guys, and I guess this is why I'm getting into why this is such an important documentary. You got 4 guys at, young, early 20s by the time fame hits, that had been performing together since they were practically teenagers when they first formed the band. And the level of fame, and I guess for those that need some kind of context for more recent memory, this is where you have steps. You had your Frank Sinatras and Dean Martins and stuff like that, but Frank was sort of like the one or the first one where the girls are screaming, and then Elvis comes along and takes that to a whole nother level, and then here these guys come along and take it to a whole nother level, and the momentum to carry that for those few years that they did, to do that and still come out with innovative music and change the game on that level, it takes a toll, and then, like I said, you grow up. You grow up. It's like, what's the reason at 60 to hang out, whether, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, to hang out like you did when you were 17. It's not practical. You grow up, you get married, you have families, or you just want to do other things. You just don't want to do, and it's nothing personal, but you just grow up, and that's just the fact of life. That's just how it is. That's just how it is. But they put the breakup in a better context. I know one of the things, and I guess to kind of keep it on that positive spin, because I always wondered what other Beatles fans thought about, like, watching the documentary, whether it was on television or whether they got the DVD. It has like comments, from the three surviving Beatles at that time. This is what where George is like, hey, they gave their screams, we gave our nervous systems, which is a harder thing to give. You've got, Paul saying, oh, I'm glad the songs are about peace and love and all of this. And, Ringo's like, yeah, we were four brothers that loved each other very much. And then, it's John's comment at the end, where it's like, oh, it's just a rock group that's split up. You got the old records if you want to reminisce. I guess, I don't know, because I was like, yeah, well, yeah, I was probably about the same age as they were when they were splitting up at that time. So at that age, I'm thinking like, whoa, yeah, I get it. Yeah, what's the big deal? But, now when they changed that and they swapped it out for, John saying something a bit more positive, which I think would be more reflective of how he would think about it now. To me, like, sometimes Beatles fans are similar to Prince fans, and I guess it might be universal amongst every artist, where you have, there's somebody that's got something to say about something, something negative to say about something all the time. And I don't know, some, oh, he wouldn't have done it, or Yoko wouldn't have let him do this, and this wouldn't have happened, and that wouldn't have happened. But I don't know, there's a episode 9 in this, which is a bonus episode, and it focuses on the making of the songs Free as a Bird, Real Love, Now and Then, where they took some tracks or took some demos that John Lennon was working on, they never got a chance to complete, and made 3, I think, really great songs out of them. They sound like, for the most part, Beatles records. It's like, wow, it's the Beatles, but contemporary, but present, in the now. There's a comment in episode 9, where George goes, well, yeah, they had the lawsuits, and, there was sort of where nobody, one wasn't speaking to the other, or, there was that. But here now is this opportunity where everybody's friendly again, and all the bad business, all the bad blood is now behind them. And that he felt sorriest for John because he never got to experience that closure. And I think that would have happened. And I think everybody's memories of the Beatles, because that was the other thing they talked about in this other episode too, is that they couldn't have done this documentary in 1975, because even though some stuff was getting settled, there was still a lot of other unfinished business. I think it was at a point John and Paul were just beginning to kind of repair their relationship. But, there was still something hanging over it. And I don't think it would have been as effective of a documentary as when they did it in 1995 and the way it's being presented in 2025. But I think, where he says he felt the most sorry is for John because he never got to have that closure. But I think it would have been, I think it's a better quote to swap out. It's the original quote is the more controversial one. And like I said, 29-year-old me then would have been like, yeah. But now it's like, no, the other thing that's pointed out is that, where George says that, the Beatles are going to go beyond, what these four individuals were, which harkens kind of back to another comment earlier in it that they've added in from John earlier in the series, where it's like, if it was John and Paul and two other people, it wouldn't have worked. It would not have been the Beatles. And I know, and there's been a couple of episodes recently where I've kind of, echoed that sentiment about group dynamics, the Beatles, John, Paul, George, Ringo. I don't think it would have worked if it was John, Paul, George, and Steve, or John, Paul, Steve and Edie. I don't, it wouldn't have worked, without those four. History shows it needed those four. They had a drummer, Pete Best, but for whatever, he wasn't as proficient as Ringo. And I mean, George Martin, the producer, was like, look, I like the other three guys, but if we make the records, I'm going to use a professional drummer. And it was like, at that point, they got rid of him, and they wanted Ringo because he was the best drummer in Liverpool. And the times that Ringo sat in with him during times when Pete wasn't available, it clicked. It worked. There's, where there's a speech that Paul gives when Ringo's being inducted to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That's not on the documentary, but you can find that on YouTube. Talking about just the first, after the first count in, the first note, it was just like they knew it clicked. They all looked at each other like, yeah, this is it. I've said the time, as much as I've enjoyed seeing performances of Morris Day and the Time, to me, it's the time when it was the original 7 members, sadly, which we've lost one recently. It's that dynamic. And I'll probably punctuate this with the reason why this is important. Like I said, you're going to have older Beatle fans that are just mad because of whatever, whether it's, oh, I wanted Rubber Soul, or, oh, I don't like the box set of the anthology, or they cut 15 minutes and I wanted to see that scene of Paul coughing when he said this, or, where Ringo says peace and love for 25 times throughout the whatever. I'm being facetious about it, but it's that thing, and it's like, oh, they're pandering to the younger fans. And I was just watching something, Polygram. I was watching that channel on YouTube, where he was reviewing the anthology, the box set, and the question of who is this for? And we're getting at a point. I'm a second generation Beatles fan, first generation Prince fan. And where I think I see the similarities in both, and especially with the fan base. I'm kind of, what was pointed out in this episode was that you have these debates, but I think it's healthy for these debates to keep this stuff out here, so yeah, if you're first generation fan and you're grumbling that you're not getting everything you want in favor, they're doing this because yes, the world is changing. Sadly, we're aging out. I would say the Beatles fans more so than Prince fans. I would say first generation Prince fans, where we are, we've got another 10, 15 years before that demographic really begins to shrink, where it really begins to shrink. And the way that music is consumed now with streaming and everything, yes, vinyl's back, but not everybody's into vinyl, even though it's back. It's not like it was when it was the only medium, or vinyl and cassettes were the only medium that was available. Oh, don't forget 8-track, early 70s. But it's a world that's changing. And I was watching another thing on YouTube where a guy was pointing out how there are literally no bands. And I love the basic dictionary definition of a band, which is, instrumentalists and or vocalists that, comprises a group, to, for performance or for records or for whatever. And, that is inclusive to, when we had even rap crews. I think like in this generation, I think the Migos were the only rap group that was around still, back in, but, before then we had Public Enemy, we had Run DMC. We have a multitude of solo artists, male, female, rock, hip hop, country, whatever, a whole slew of individual artists. But I think the thing that kind of bugs me now is the sort of, the sort of dumbing down when it comes to, the R&B and hip hop. Then you've got the sort of American Idol / The Voice, X Factor way of artists now. So so those two things, and a lot of those even in combination, it doesn't create anything. There's so much I was checking out before putting this episode together. I'm trying to wrap this up too, but what was I watching? I was watching something else, and I just lost my train of thought on it. But getting back to where there's no band. Oh, I forgot. I was watching an interview with Sean Lennon talking about the documentary, the One-to-One documentary, which is something I recommend. It's a little unorthodox as a documentary, but what was so brilliant about what it was showing, the concept was, not just about what, John Lennon's activities were in the 70s, but what they used to kind of sort of frame that context were his television watching habits. And especially then, just having moved to New York with Yoko and watching American television and the way he would flip through the dials. But the things that were going on in the 70s are basically, it's history repeating itself in some way, shape, or form now. The only difference is that we don't have an artist like a John Lennon to be that voice, to say whatever. We don't have any voices. There's no bands. There's no single major rock star that really has that type of intelligence to do that. Or you go on the social media sites and nobody's saying anything because they're scared they're going to get canceled. You look at Lennon's career. It's like, followed by the FBI. Who wants that type of heat? Who wants that? But but there's got to be a counter to that. There's all this. It's funny how people on one side are saying freedom of speech, but it only applies to them. So the minute you disagree with something, then it's like, oh, how dare you cancel that person? This. It. Like I said, we had, and even if you didn't have artists, but damn, you still had Stevie Wonder that was just as effective in the 70s. We don't have that voice. It's all about, ooh, I got this hot beat, and ooh, I got this hot hook, and I'm making tons of money. But, unless you got some kind of, investment plan, and I'm not talking about investing in your uncle's rib shack. Also, too, is another thing I was watched T-Pain's cautionary tale about investing in his uncle's, draws with, that are sewn into the pants. What was it, 250 grand? loss. But I mean, like, I mean, actual viable investment. Unless you got something like that and you have wealth managed for your future generations to come, then yeah, you that stack that wad of cash you holding in the video, it's gonna go just like that. So why I'm saying this is the most important documentary is because yeah, why I want younger people to see this documentary, because maybe it'll put a spark into somebody wanting to start a band, like look, despite the heaviness, and yeah, you may put one together and it may go 5 years, it may go 10 years, whatever, and you'll split up like they did. But the thing is, watch this to see how you can utilize that time, because it's not all about the fame, the fortune, the money. Keep your circle tight. They only had a few people. They didn't have like a big entourage. Like Elvis, which they point out. They felt sorry for Elvis because it was just the one dude. And that's the thing with a lot of these solo artists, and I think that's engineered by like why the emphasis is placed on whether the even if they're coming off American Idol or X Factor or whatever, it's a situation where they can be controlled. A lot of these youngsters, coming up, it's like, yeah, of course, you're tired of being broke. You're tired of being hungry. You really don't want to be in the streets. You really don't want to do the street life. So you feel like this, if not sports, this is your way out. But, control your narrative, put the stuff out yourself, be your own record label or something. But like I say, to utilize the time that you have and make it count. Be more of an inspiration to those that come after with that. So I mean, like I said, maybe this will spark a band to do something. Maybe we can get it doesn't have to be another Beatles, it doesn't have to be another time, but that level of creativity, that level of musicianship, that level of tightness is something, it's an energy that is sorely missing in this current generation. Because, computers can only do so much. A program beat can only do so much. It's designed to only go so far. And not to say that that's not creative, but like I said, the 60s, I say, even far back as rock and roll. Because, I mean, Elvis was different from Little Richard. Little Richard was different from Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry was different from Jerry Lee Lewis. Jerry Lee Lewis was different from the Everly Brothers, and so on and so forth. The 60s was a greater cultural exchange. The 70s were a greater cultural exchange. It was only these labels and companies, that, advertisers, marketers, that's like, oh, well, we got to put this and call it rock. Ooh, we got to put this over here and we'll call it rap. We'll put this over here and call this and this and this and this, whatever. When, it was more of a cultural exchange back then, at least amongst the greater artists. Now some of the lesser artists were still stuck in whatever neighborhoods they came out of, or, others coming up were programmed by what Rolling Stone was telling them was hip and cool and whatever like that. But the greatest of the greats, no, it's not. No, I'm not stuck in this genre. There's other genres, and it's like, ooh, well, if I could put it like a little classical figure here, or a little jazz note here, or I can take this blues figure and do something else with it. So yeah, the greatest of the greats, which what I like, they added John's explanation early on, like, he liked Elvis, he liked Chuck Berry, he liked Little Richard, and he went and he studied these records. Like, how do these records work? Why is this giving me such joy that I want to do it? Whether you like this current configuration of Anthology, whether you like the box set, or whether you still wishing you had Rubber Soul, Prince listeners, it's like, oh, you're mad that the deluxe edition is just a deluxe edition. There's no box set of Around the World Today. You know, all of that is irrelevant to just the spark of joy that these records give you. It takes away from that. That selfishness takes away from that. You know, just enjoy that the fact that it's 2025 and people are still talking about the Beatles, that it's 2025 and that we don't have a brand new record from Prince that we can count on to try to keep it going. Yeah, you know, there's other topics I could get into, but that's really just what it comes down to, why this documentary is so important. You know, let me know if you've seen it. Let me know if you're planning to see it. Hopefully watching this, like I said, mostly this is a Prince channel, but you know, Round the World in a Day, that's out. That has a lot of Beatles influence on that record. Parade 2 that's coming out, there's still hints of Beatle influence on 25% of that album as well. D'Angelo, you know, coming out with the Black Messiah, you know, was listening to, you know, taking that deeper dive with early Funkadelic, with Hendrix and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin, you know, taking those early dives. So hopefully this will make you want to check, you know, like I said, get the whole story. You know, get the full story. Why is there so much hubbub about this band? You know, why do we keep talking about this band? Check it out, you know, but let me know what you think. Leave me a note in the comments. At this point, I know we're in the middle of the holiday season now. I'm gonna try to get one more episode out, then I may kind of step back for a little bit. So you probably see after that more shorts and more chopped up versions of this video and other videos. Until then, like I said, revamping some stuff, which I'll talk about as stuff kind of gets more crystal clear around here. So until then, once you create your day, create your life. Peace.